The first signs of trouble in a neighborhood rarely begin with shouting, confrontation, or a dramatic scene. Instead, they often creep in quietly, disguised as harmless misunderstandings that slowly reveal themselves as something much larger. When I moved into the cul-de-sac, I assumed the street would be like any other suburban pocket, quiet, predictable, and mostly uneventful. The neighbors kept to themselves, the lawns were trimmed, and the houses all mirrored one another in that repetitive architectural pattern common in planned communities. But beneath that calm veneer, I would soon learn that the neighborhood operated under a unique unwritten law. Everything was fine as long as things went according to Karen's standards. Karen lived 2 houses down, though it felt more accurate to say the neighborhood lived under her rather than alongside her. She was the type who walked with a clipboard, even when she wasn't doing anything that required one. A self-appointed guardian of rules, she often invented herself. She had a reputation for policing mailbox heights, declaring certain garden gnomes visual hazards, and delivering ominous warnings about trash cans placed even an inch off alignment. At the time, I chalked these stories up to exaggeration. Every community had at least one person like her. Someone starved for control, someone who believed authority was something you awarded yourself. I kept to myself, worked long shifts, and used my truck mainly for commuting. My driveway was wide enough for 2 vehicles, though I rarely parked anything other than my truck there. Then came the day when I noticed a silver sedan I didn't recognize sitting snugly in the middle of my driveway when I pulled in after work. At first, I wondered if a friend of the previous homeowners hadn't gotten the memo about the sale of the house, but the sedan wasn't a one-time visitor. Yeah. Over the next several days, it reappeared again and again, each time parked with even more confidence, as if claiming the spot entirely. It didn't take long before a neighbor quietly clued me in. The car belonged to Karen. She had told others that my driveway was overflow parking and said the previous owners didn't mind. The explanation was so bizarre, so casually delusional, that I wasn't even angry at first, just baffled. Still, I moved forward cautiously. I left polite notes. I mentioned it to her once in passing. I repositioned my truck in an attempt to block off access. None of it worked. If anything, the situation escalated as if she interpreted every attempt at communication as a challenge or provocation. The more firmly I tried to reclaim my own property, the more defiant she became. The breaking point arrived on a Wednesday afternoon. I was at work halfway across town, completely unaware that Karen had decided to take things to a level no reasonable person would ever imagine. According to a neighbor who later told me the full story, she marched down my driveway with the same authoritarian posture she used when reporting imaginary violations, inspecting my parked truck like it was a trespassing vehicle on her land. She paced around it, snapped photos, made exaggerated gestures of disapproval, and finally called the tow company as if performing some dramatic civic duty. She told them my truck was illegally parked, that it was blocking access, and that she, as a concerned neighbor, needed it removed immediately. And unbelievably, they complied. Because the tow driver didn't check property boundaries, or perhaps didn't care, they hitched up my vehicle and hauled it away before anyone could intervene. I returned home hours later to find my driveway empty, the absence of my truck hitting me with a hollow, surreal shock. For a few seconds, my brain scrambled for any logical explanation. Had I parked somewhere else? Had my truck been stolen? Had I misremembered entirely? But the cold reality crystallized as soon as I spotted the tire scrapes on the concrete and the imprint of tow chains. The moment I realized what happened, anger didn't come in a sudden burst. It grew slow and heavy, settling into my chest with a weight I could feel in every breath. This wasn't an accident. This wasn't a misunderstanding. Someone had the audacity to enter my property and remove my vehicle as if I had no rights at all. It wasn't long before word spread around the neighborhood, as it always does. A few neighbors approached me with sympathetic hesitations, letting me know they had seen Karen orchestrating the tow like she was the sheriff of some imaginary town. They apologized on her behalf, even though they weren't responsible. They warned me she had a history of overstepping boundaries, but had never gone this far before. The more people talked, the more a pattern emerged. a pattern of entitlement, manipulation, and control she'd been exercising for years. She had simply never met someone willing to push back. That night, I sat in my living room with every light off, replaying the situation from every angle and considering every possible next step. There was anger, but beneath that was something sharper: determination. Karen had crossed a line most people would never approach, and she had done so with complete confidence that she'd get away with it. She believed she owned the neighborhood, that everyone would cave the moment she barked an order. But she had made one fatal miscalculation. She assumed I would be another quiet resident who swallowed injustice for the sake of keeping the peace. She assumed wrong. By morning, the path ahead was already taking shape in my mind. I retrieved paperwork, property maps, survey details, and photos. I documented everything. The toe scratches, the driveway measurements, the exact placement of the survey pins that clearly defined my property line. Every detail was fuel, every fact a tool, every piece of evidence a step toward accountability. Karen had taken my truck. But she had also given me something far more powerful: proof. Proof that she had violated my rights. Proof that she had acted with deliberate intent. Proof that would soon become the foundation of a case she never expected to face. And as the sun rose that morning, lighting up the quiet cul-de-sac, I felt the first shift in what would become a long, relentless battle. One that would end not only with my truck return, but with Karen paying for every reckless decision she had made. The stage was set, and the real fight was only beginning. The morning after the tow felt different, as if the entire neighborhood existed in a quiet suspension, waiting to see what I would do now that Karen had crossed a line no one thought possible. The sun rose slowly over the rooftops, casting long shadows across the cul-de-sac, and for the first time since moving in, I felt a kind of clarity settle over me. The shock had worn off, replaced by a cold, deliberate purpose. I knew I needed to gather every shred of proof, every piece of documentation, every tiny detail that would demonstrate beyond doubt that Karen had trespassed, interfered with my property, and caused significant financial harm. People often underestimate the importance of groundwork. They rush to confrontation, to shouting, to demanding immediate apologies. But battles like these aren't won with emotion, they're won with evidence, precision, and a patience the other person never expects you to have. So, before even retrieving my truck, I began with the foundation of the case, the land itself. My property line wasn't ambiguous. The survey pins were in place, small metal rods pounded into the earth at the exact corners outlined by the county surveyors. They had been there long before I purchased the home, marked in the official plat map and visible to anyone who bothered to look. But Karen, in her self-appointed authority, had apparently decided she didn't need to look. I walked around the edges of my driveway and lawn, photographing each survey pin from multiple angles, making sure the timestamps were clear. I took wide shots that showed their location relative to the street, as well as close-ups that captured the engraved identification numbers. I even recorded a slow video walkthrough narrating the exact placement, knowing that a judge would appreciate visual clarity later. Then I photographed the scrape marks left by the tow truck. Dark, heavy streaks where the chain had dragged, as well as the impressions the truck's wheels had left while forcing itself into the narrow space between Karen's encroaching sense of entitlement and my private property. Every mark told a story of a vehicle removed not from a street, not from a shared space, but from a driveway fully owned by me. By the time I finished documenting everything, the anger that had burned hot inside me had cooled into something stronger. Certainty. Certainty that I had the facts. Certainty that Karen had no defense. Certainty that the moment this reached a courtroom, she would be exposed for exactly what she was. Still, documenting the physical evidence was only the first step. Karen didn't just take my truck. She created a ripple of witnesses, people who had seen her orchestrate the entire event with the smug confidence of someone who believed the world would always bend to her will. I began speaking with neighbors, not confrontationally, not accusingly, but calmly, asking them what they had observed. Several admitted they had watched her pacing around my driveway that afternoon, waving her hands dramatically as if giving orders on a movie set. One elderly neighbor confessed she had watched the tow truck hook up my vehicle and had called Karen over to ask whether she was sure she had the authority to remove someone else's car from their own property. Karen apparently had dismissed her concern with a dismissive wave and an indignant explanation about community standards. Another neighbor said Karen had bragged afterward that she had finally taught the new guy how things worked around here. Every witness statement painted the same picture. Karen's act wasn't impulsive. It was deliberate, calculated, and rooted in a false sense of dominance she had cultivated for years. I recorded each conversation with permission, ensuring every witness felt comfortable with their words being used in a formal claim. Most of them were more than willing. They were tired of Karen's tyrannical behavior and wanted anyone to finally stand up to her. As the hours passed, the case grew stronger, each detail slotting into place like pieces of a puzzle that revealed the truth with increasing clarity. My next step was retrieving the truck from the impound lot. Tow yards have a unique atmosphere, cold, impersonal, and intentionally inconvenient. They build barriers, both physical and bureaucratic, to discourage complaints. Still, when I presented my title and registration, the clerk's expression shifted noticeably when I explained the situation. Even she admitted that tow drivers typically avoid removing vehicles from private driveways unless explicitly instructed by a property owner. When I confirmed that I hadn't requested the tow, she nodded with a kind of weary resignation that said she had seen this type of power play drama before. The retrieval fee was steep, hundreds of dollars for the tow itself, plus daily storage fees that accumulated by the hour. I paid it, fully aware that every dollar would end up on Karen's bill before all of this was over. On the drive back home, the truck rattled slightly, a reminder of the rough handling it had received. I made sure to stop by a mechanic to document any potential damage caused during the tow. I wasn't interested in exaggeration or revenge. I simply wanted the truth recorded. The mechanic found a bent tie rod and scraped undercarriage. Nothing catastrophic, but enough to justify compensation. Another piece of evidence added to the growing folder. By evening, everything was organized. Photographs, video walkthroughs, witness accounts, tow yard records, mechanic reports, property maps, survey documentation. My case file looked less like the beginning of a neighborhood dispute and more like the preparation for a civil lawsuit. And yet throughout all of this, Karen had made no attempt to speak to me. No apology, no explanation, not even a fake justification she could cling to. Instead, she avoided me entirely, retreating into her house like someone expecting backlash but refusing to acknowledge it. Her silence spoke volumes. It wasn't the silence of innocence. It was the silence of someone who knew she had crossed a boundary and didn't want to face the consequences. But consequences were coming. Not in the form of lawn ornaments placed out of spite or passive-aggressive notes taped to doors. No, the consequences would arrive through the one channel Karen had always believed she had mastery over: authority. And this time, authority wouldn't be on her side. As darkness settled over the neighborhood and porch lights flicked on one by one, I sat in my living room, reviewing everything one last time. The case was airtight. The evidence was thorough. And now, with the foundation firmly in place, it was time to take the next step, one that would turn this from a neighborhood disagreement into a legal battle Karen would never forget. The sun would rise soon enough on a new phase of this confrontation, and when it did, the balance of power would finally shift. The next morning arrived with a heavy stillness, the kind that settles over a place just before something significant happens. And I could feel that the tide of this entire situation was beginning to turn. The evidence I had collected the day before sat neatly organized on my dining table, the stack of documentation almost looking out of place in the quiet domestic setting of my home. Yet each page, each photograph, each witness statement represented something far larger than a simple conflict. They represented a boundary that had been crossed and a response that was long overdue. I knew that if I let Karen's actions slide, if I allowed her to rewrite my property lines in her mind and conduct herself like the self-appointed ruler of the cul-de-sac, she would never stop. The tow would be just the beginning. She would escalate, invent new violations, punish anyone who didn't bow to her invented authority. That had been her pattern for years, according to the neighbors. People tolerated her simply because no one wanted to be the one to challenge her. But I had reached the point where silence was no longer an option. The first step in moving forward was filing a police report. Not as a dramatic gesture, but as a necessary record, the kind that courts respect and insurance companies rely on. When I walked into the local station carrying the thick folder of evidence, the officer at the reception desk looked mildly surprised by the sheer volume of paperwork I carried. But surprise shifted quickly to attentiveness as I explained, calmly and methodically, how my truck had been removed from my private driveway without permission. The officer took notes, occasionally asking for clarification on the placement of the survey pins or the involvement of the tow truck driver. When I showed the photographs, he frowned with the kind of concern that suggested he had seen many property disputes, but rarely one this blatantly one-sided. The report was filed, stamped, and added to the growing chain of formal records that would later become essential in court. With that completed, I headed next to the county assessor's office to obtain certified copies of my property plat and ownership documents. The clerk behind the window, an older gentleman with silver-rimmed glasses and decades of experience navigating property lines, raised an eyebrow when I explained why I needed them. He chuckled softly, not out of amusement but recognition, and mentioned that he had seen a Karen-like personalities before who believed shared sidewalks or adjacent easements gave them ownership over anything nearby. He handed me the certified documents with a sympathetic nod. I added them to the folder, each new document reinforcing the truth Karen had tried to bulldoze with entitlement. But the critical step, the one that would convert all of this into a formal legal action, required a visit to a civil attorney. I chose a local firm known for handling property disputes and neighbor conflicts, the kind of cases most attorneys avoided because they tended to be emotionally charged and dragged out. But the lawyer I met with, a calm and confident woman named Dana, welcomed the challenge. As she sifted through my carefully organized evidence, her expression shifted from professional interest to sharp focus. She remarked that my case was unusually strong, especially because Karen hadn't simply trespassed. She had orchestrated the removal of my property and caused financial damage on top of it. Dana explained the potential avenues: trespass, conversion, property damage, towing fees, reimbursement, and even punitive damages if the judge deemed Karen's behavior reckless enough. She said the courts took these matters seriously, especially when a homeowner's rights were violated so blatantly. With her guidance, we drafted the lawsuit, detailing every aspect of Karen's actions in a clear, methodical narrative supported by time-stamped photographs and witness testimony. The filing fee was another cost added to the growing list, but I paid it without hesitation, knowing each expense would ultimately be Karen's responsibility once the judgment fell. Walking out of the attorney's office with the stamped filing documents in hand felt like a turning point. Not a moment of victory, but a moment of control. For the first time since the tow, I felt the balance shift. The situation was no longer me reacting to Karen's absurd overreach. It was now Karen who would have to respond to authority she couldn't manipulate or intimidate. In the days that followed, the atmosphere in the neighborhood became noticeably tense. Neighbors whispered across driveways, glancing toward Karen's house with a mixture of curiosity and anticipation. Word spread quickly that I had taken legal action. Some people quietly expressed support, grateful that someone had finally pushed back against the tyranny that had hovered over the cul-de-sac for far too long. Others simply watched, waiting to see if Karen would retaliate or retreat. Karen herself remained conspicuously silent. Her blinds stayed closed. Her driveway, usually the staging ground for her complaints and critiques, sat empty. She didn't walk her usual patrols around the cul-de-sac with her clipboard in hand. It was as if she had retreated behind her walls, hoping the storm would pass without requiring her to confront it. But the storm was already at her doorstep. When the process server arrived and delivered the lawsuit documents directly into her hands, the neighborhood seemed to hold its breath. Those who witnessed the delivery described Karen's expression as a mix of shock, indignation, and something she rarely displayed. Fear not of me, but of the consequences she had triggered through her own arrogance. It was in that moment, they said, that she finally understood this wasn't a petty disagreement or a simple warning. It was a legal battle she couldn't control or escape through manipulation. While Karen stood in silence, I continued preparing, making sure every piece of evidence was backed up, organized, and airtight. I anticipated every angle she might try to use in her defense: claims of misunderstanding, attempts to frame the driveway as shared space, assertions of previous arrangements with former owners. None of it would hold. The official documents erased all ambiguity. The witness statements undermined any attempt at rewriting history. The tow yard records proved she had acted without authority and under false pretenses. And as the court date drew closer, I could feel the momentum building, the slow inevitability of justice beginning to take shape. By the time the hearing was scheduled, the case was no longer just about my truck. It was about the neighborhood finally confronting the person who had caused years of unnecessary conflict. Karen had spent years ruling with intimidation disguised as concern, with micromanagement disguised as neighborly oversight. But the facade was cracking, and soon it would shatter entirely. As I closed the final binder of evidence one evening, reviewing the documents one last time under the soft glow of my living room lamp, I felt a quiet confidence settle in. Not arrogance, not triumph, just certainty. Certainty that the facts were on my side. Certainty that Karen's recklessness would finally meet accountability. Certainty that the judge would see through every excuse she tried to muster. The confrontation that Karen had unknowingly started would soon reach its peak. And as the night deepened and the neighborhood lay silent, I knew the next chapter would take this battle out of the cul-de-sac and into the courtroom where the truth would finally be laid bare. The morning of the hearing arrived with the kind of crisp stillness that makes every sound sharper, every movement more deliberate, as if the world itself understands the significance of the day. I woke before my alarm, not from nerves, but from a steady anticipation that had been building over weeks of preparation. Every document had been reviewed, every photograph double-checked, every witness statement neatly organized into the binder that now sat on my kitchen table, waiting to be carried into the courtroom. There was a quiet finality to it all, the sense that this was the day everything shifted from the realm of neighborhood whispers and private frustrations into the structured arena where facts, not personalities, dictated the outcome. As I drove to the courthouse, the weight of the situation settled not like a burden but like armor, reinforcing the resolve that had carried me from the moment I discovered my driveway empty. The sun rose behind me, casting long shadows across the road, and for a brief moment I thought about how many people had been pushed around by someone like Karen. How many homeowners had been bullied into silence simply because they didn't know the rules, didn't want confrontation, or weren't prepared to fight back. Today wasn't just about my truck, it was about standing against a pattern of behavior that had festered in the neighborhood for too long. When I arrived, my attorney, Dana, was already waiting. Her calm confidence was reassuring, and as we walked through the courthouse hallway lined with wooden benches and echoing footsteps, she reminded me that our evidence was strong enough to withstand any attempt Karen might make to twist the narrative. Still, I felt the tension tightening slightly as we entered the courtroom, a modest space with high ceilings, rows of benches, and the judge's bench elevated at the far end. The air felt heavy with anticipation, the quiet punctuated only by the shuffling of papers and the occasional cough from someone waiting for their own case. Then Karen arrived. She stepped through the courtroom doors with the stiff, brittle posture of someone who had spent her entire life performing certainty without ever actually possessing it. She clutched an overstuffed binder that seemed more like a prop than a collection of meaningful documents and walked with purposeful steps meant to convey control. But her eyes, darting around the room, told a different story, one of anxiety, confusion, and the dawning realization that she was not in a cul-de-sac she could dominate. She was in a courtroom where her inflated sense of authority meant nothing. As she took her seat across the aisle, she made a point of avoiding eye contact, her chin lifted in defiance that looked increasingly fragile. When the judge entered and the room rose to its feet, the atmosphere shifted fully into formality. The judge, a measured and composed woman with sharp eyes, called our case forward. What followed was a slow, methodical unveiling of everything Karen had tried to bury under her entitlement. Dana began by presenting the certified property documents, laying out the precise boundaries of my driveway with maps, highlighted survey lines, and official county records. She explained how the survey pins had been in place long before I purchased the house, legally defining the space Karen had claimed as her overflow parking. The judge listened intently, occasionally nodding as she examined the documents. Then came the photographs, clear, time-stamped, irrefutable visual proof. The survey pins, the tire marks from the tow truck, the scratches from the chains, the placement of my truck on the driveway where it had always belonged. The judge asked a few clarifying questions, her tone neutral but firm, carefully dissecting the timeline to ensure complete understanding. Karen's posture stiffened more with each new piece of evidence, her expression tightening as if the walls around her narrative were collapsing inch by inch. Next, the witness statements were introduced. Neighbors' accounts detailed her pacing around my driveway, her exaggerated gestures, her insistence that she had authority to tow my truck, and the tow truck driver's unquestioning compliance. The statements confirmed not only that she had initiated the tow, but that she had done so without hesitation, without permission, and without any legitimate justification. With each statement read aloud, Karen's reactions grew more strained. Quick breaths, clenched jaw, trembling fingers gripping her binder. Then came the tow yard documentation and the mechanic's report showing the physical damage caused by the unauthorized removal. Watch, Dana presented the towing invoice and the storage fees, making it clear that I had paid out of necessity and not choice. The judge examined everything with meticulous attention, making notes in the margins of the documents before placing them neatly onto the growing stack before her. When our presentation concluded, the courtroom fell silent. Then the judge turned to Karen. Her voice was calm but carried the weight of expectation as she asked whether Karen wanted to respond to the claims. Karen rose awkwardly, shuffling a stack of papers with trembling hands, and began speaking in a thin, strained voice that lacked the domineering confidence she displayed in the neighborhood. She rambled about community expectations, about how the previous owners had never minded her parking on the driveway, about how she believed she had the right to maintain order in the cul-de-sac. But her explanation quickly unraveled under the judge's pointed questions. When asked if she had any written agreement with the previous homeowners regarding the use of the driveway, she stuttered and admitted she did not. When asked if she had checked property records before having the truck towed, she conceded she hadn't. When asked if she had obtained my permission to call the tow company, her silence served as its own admission. The judge's expression didn't change, but her tone grew firmer as she reminded Karen that private property rights are protected by law, not by personal preference or perceived neighborhood roles. When Karen attempted to argue that the driveway felt shared, the judge cut through the argument with a sharp clarification. Feelings do not override recorded legal boundaries. By the time Karen sat down, deflated and visibly shaken, the outcome was all but inevitable. The judge reviewed the evidence once more, then delivered her ruling with clarity and finality. Karen was ordered to reimburse the full cost of the tow, storage fees, and mechanical repairs. She was also ordered to pay additional damages for trespass and the unauthorized removal of my property. And then, in a decision that sent a ripple of disbelief through the courtroom, the judge mandated a formal written apology to be posted on the neighborhood's online forum, a public acknowledgement of her wrongdoing. The words hung in the air like a decisive strike of a gavel long before the physical gavel fell. Karen sat frozen, her face drained of the superiority she once wore like armor. The courtroom was silent except for the soft scratching of the judge finishing her notes. As the hearing concluded and we were dismissed, I gathered my binder with a sense of closure. Not triumph, not gloating, but relief. The truth had been laid bare, and the consequences were no longer abstract. They were written, ordered, and enforced. Karen had built her reputation on control, but in the end, the law stood unshaken against her behavior. As I stepped out of the courthouse into the bright midday sun, I felt the weight of the past weeks lift from my shoulders. The battle that had started with an empty driveway was finally turning toward its resolution. But the aftermath, the reaction from the neighborhood, Karen's public apology, and the unraveling of the power she once held was still to come. In the days following the court hearing, the neighborhood seemed to vibrate with a cautious, electric tension, as though every house on the cul-de-sac was adjusting to a new gravitational center now that Karen's decades-long orbit of dominance had finally been disrupted. When I returned home after the ruling, the street felt strangely still, almost contemplative. Like the quiet that lingers after a storm has passed, but before people open their doors to assess the damage. Neighbors who had once kept their distance out of fear of becoming Karen's next target now looked at me with a mixture of relief, admiration, and disbelief, as if they couldn't quite accept that the era of Karen's unchecked authority was coming to an end. Some offered subtle nods, others brief words of support, but most reacted with quiet smiles that said far more than they dared to speak aloud. For the first time since moving in, I felt the neighborhood acknowledging me not as an outsider or a newcomer, but as someone who had done what many had long wished they could. But the true shift, the one everyone seemed to hold their breath for, was still waiting to unfold in the shadows of Karen's two-story house at the end of the cul-de-sac. Her blinds, once perpetually open as she monitored every movement on the street, now remained shut day after day. Her trademark morning patrol with her clipboard vanished entirely, replaced by a solitary silence that wrapped around her property like a heavy fog. It was as if the ruling had stripped her of the identity she had spent years crafting, leaving her unsure of how to function without the imagined authority she had enforced for so long. But the legal consequences were only part of the fallout. The judge's order requiring her to post a public apology on the neighborhood's online forum, Nextdoor, the digital battleground she once dominated, was the ripple that would soon become a shockwave. Everyone knew it was coming. Everyone waited for it. And for 3 tense days, nothing happened. Then, on a quiet Thursday evening, just as porch lights began flickering on and the sun dipped below the rooftops, the notification appeared. A Karen from Maple Glen posted a neighborhood updates. The entire cul-de-sac seemed to inhale at once. I opened the post slowly, my thumb hovering over the screen as if the moment itself required a certain reverence. The message was longer than I expected, its tone noticeably different from the commanding, condescending voice Karen typically used online. It lacked her usual certainty, her usual edge, her usual superiority. Instead, it carried a restrained, almost reluctant humility. In the apology, ordered by the court and clearly written under the weight of humiliation, she acknowledged her wrongdoing, admitted to having my truck towed without permission, confirmed that she had overstepped, and expressed regret for her actions. The words, while formal and stiff, were a public admission that she had crossed a legal and ethical boundary, and seeing it in writing broke something in the invisible hierarchy she had built over the years. The comments beneath the post grew rapidly. Nearly every household had something to say. Duh. Some offered polite acknowledgments, others gently emphasized the importance of respecting property lines, and a few, who had long suffered under her scrutiny, couldn't resist adding thinly veiled reminders of past grievances. Yet the overwhelming tone was one of collective exhale, like a neighborhood finally processing the release of pressure that had quietly built for far too long. It didn't take long for stories to emerge, cautious at first, then pouring out like water from a cracked dam. Neighbors began sharing their own experiences, incidents they had once kept private to avoid confrontation. Warnings about lawn heights, complaints about holiday decorations, demands to repaint fences, threats about trash cans left out for an extra hour. Even small children, now older, recalled being scolded for riding scooters too fast past her driveway. As the days passed, the narrative that had once painted Karen as the self-appointed guardian of a community order crumbled entirely, replaced by a well-documented pattern of overstepping, intimidation, and entitlement. And yet, despite the flood of long-suppressed frustration, no one particularly wanted to see her destroyed. What people wanted, what they had always wanted, was a neighborhood free from her obsession with control. They wanted peace, simplicity, normalcy, and the court's ruling had finally created space for that possibility. But while the neighborhood found its voice, Karen remained silent. Her house, once a hub of constant movement and unsolicited oversight, seemed frozen in time. Days passed without seeing her leave. Her car, usually parked precisely within her driveway lines, didn't move. The rigid posture she once carried with pride had vanished behind her walls, leaving only a lingering ghost of the authority she once wielded. Some neighbors debated whether she would move, unable to face the people she once ruled over. Others speculated she might attempt to reclaim her influence once things quieted down. But I saw something different in her silence. Not strategizing, not defiance, but the collapse of a long-held illusion. She had built her identity on the belief that she was doing what was best for the community, but the courtroom, the apology, and the public reaction had forced her to confront a truth she had never allowed herself to consider. She wasn't a protector. She was the problem. And yet, even with the apologies posted and the legal judgment settled, the personal aftermath still lingered for me. The victory hadn't brought the satisfaction I thought it would, not because it wasn't deserved, but because it highlighted how deeply a single person's entitlement could fracture the balance of a community. I felt relief, certainly, and a renewed sense of ownership over my home, but also a lingering weight that would take time to lift. As the cul-de-sac settled into a new rhythm, neighbors became more open, more welcoming, almost as if shedding the fear that had kept them isolated for years. Conversations sprouted at mailboxes, friendly waves turned into shared stories, and the community began to feel like a place where people lived with each other rather than around each other. For the first time since buying the house, I began to understand what this neighborhood could be without Karen's influence dominating it. Still, the aftershocks of the court ruling weren't done unfolding. The financial penalty, the public embarrassment, and the sudden collapse of her social standing in the neighborhood were pressures that wouldn't simply dissipate. Something deeper was brewing, something that would reveal just how unprepared Karen was to navigate a world where she no longer held control. And as the days turned into a strange, uneasy calm, I sensed that the real unraveling, the one that would expose the full impact of the judgment, was only just beginning. The days leading up to the court hearing carried a strange heaviness that clung to the neighborhood like a low cloud, thick with rumor and quiet anticipation. Every small interaction felt charged. Every passing glance from a neighbor seemed to carry unspoken curiosity. Word had spread quickly, faster than anyone expected, and by the time the hearing date approached, it felt as though the entire subdivision was silently choosing sides. Some aligned themselves with Karen out of habit, loyalty, or fear of disturbing the established HOA hierarchy, while others quietly expressed their support for me, offering whispered encouragement or discreet nods as I passed by during my morning walk. But no matter the opinion, everyone agreed on one thing: this was the kind of conflict that changed neighborhoods. As I prepared my case, the evidence took shape piece by piece, forming a story that could no longer be twisted by excuses or manipulated by Karen's practiced theatrics. The towing invoice, the video footage from my doorbell camera showing the tow truck arriving and leaving my property without my consent, the photos of the survey stakes, the property lines, the plat map, and even the time-stamped text messages I had sent her warning her to stop, every detail mattered. At night, I found myself replaying the incident over and over again in my mind, analyzing every possible angle, every possible counterargument she might invent, and every potential attempt she could make to avoid accountability. Yet the more I reviewed the facts, the more undeniable the truth became. She had crossed a bright, legally defined boundary, and she had done so with full confidence that she could get away with it. But confidence was not evidence, and courtrooms did not bend to personal grudges the way HOA meetings did. Karen, meanwhile, had shifted into full-scale performance mode. She walked through the neighborhood with an air of martyrdom, clutching a thick folder filled with printed screenshots, emails, and handwritten notes she had scribbled in frantic late-night bursts. She told anyone who would listen that she was the victim, that I had verbally harassed her, that my truck was blocking her access, that I was using my driveway in a way that violated a community aesthetic guidelines, and that the OI had been forced to recommend towing, none of which was true. Her desperation grew more obvious each day. She left long rants on Nextdoor implying that I was threatening the stability of the neighborhood by or refusing to cooperate with shared resources, a phrase so vague and bizarre that even some of her usual supporters seemed confused. But the rants didn't stop, they multiplied. The more she posted, the more unhinged the narrative became, spiraling into a self-constructed fantasy where she was the heroic defender of community values, and I was the chaos she needed to neutralize. And then came the mistake, the one that would unravel everything she had built. Late one evening, a neighbor quietly slipped me a message. It was a screenshot from Karen's private group chat, a small clique of neighbors she used to rally support whenever she wanted to target someone. In the screenshot, Karen wrote openly that she didn't care what the survey said and that she would teach him a lesson by having my truck removed from the driveway. She even bragged about timing the tow while I was at work so I wouldn't have the chance to stop it. The arrogance was stunning. Arrogance was stunning. The recklessness was unbelievable, and the evidence coming from her own words was devastating. When the neighbor offered to testify if necessary, it felt like a turning point, like the truth itself had finally grown tired of being twisted. With the final piece of evidence secured, the story of what had happened became airtight. Still, I didn't approach the hearing with triumph. Instead, I approached it with a steady, deliberate calm, knowing there was no need for theatrics, no need to embellish or exaggerate. The facts were more powerful than any performance, and reality didn't need emotional manipulation to be convincing. The morning of the hearing arrived with clear skies and a cool breeze, as if the world itself were exhaling after weeks of tension. I sat quietly in the waiting area outside the courtroom, holding my neatly organized binder of evidence, each page marked, labeled, and chronologically ordered. Across from me, Karen tapped her foot rapidly, her hands trembling as she rifled through papers that looked haphazard, disorganized, and full of irrelevant printouts she believed would matter. She avoided eye contact, and for the first time since the conflict began, she looked unsure, no allies behind her, no HOA authority to hide behind, no audience to dramatize for. Just consequences. When the hearing started, everything unfolded with methodical clarity. The judge listened carefully, uninterrupted as I presented the timeline, the photos, the video clips, the documents, and the messages. Each piece slid into place like a puzzle that had always belonged together. Karen attempted to defend herself with emotional appeals, circular logic, and frantic explanations that contradicted each other. But the judge quickly focused on the core issue: property boundaries and unauthorized towing. Her excuses fell apart one by one, crumbling under the weight of her own documented intentions. But nothing compared to the moment when the judge read her group chat message aloud. For the first time in the entire ordeal, Karen went completely silent. The courtroom felt still, as though even the walls were absorbing the shock of her words. It was no longer a question of misunderstanding, it was proof of intent, a deliberate act motivated by spite and entitlement. When the judge asked her to explain the message, she had no answer. Not a single word. The evidence had spoken for her. As the hearing concluded, the outcome became all but certain. Karen's arrogance, carelessness, and disregard for boundaries had finally caught up with her, and the weight of her decisions was about to settle fully on her shoulders. And as we stepped out of the courtroom with the judgment pending but the truth undeniably established, it became clear that the next chapter would not be about proving the facts anymore. It would be about justice. And justice, once set into motion, has a way of rolling forward with unstoppable force, ready to reshape everything in its path. The ruling came down only a week after the hearing, delivered with a finality that echoed through the community like a crack of distant thunder. Though the judge's words were written in formal legal language, the meaning behind them was unmistakable. Karen had not only trespassed and interfered with my property, she had done so intentionally, maliciously, and without any legal justification. The decision was concise but devastating in its impact. The judge ordered her to reimburse the full towing fee, compensate me for the missed day of work I had spent retrieving my truck, cover the costs of repairing the damage caused by the tow truck dragging it at an angle, and pay additional punitive damages for her deliberate misconduct. Altogether, the total came to just over $18,000, a number so large that even the neighbors who had been quietly rooting for drama found themselves stunned into silence. But the ruling did not end there. In one final stroke of judicial clarity, the judge ordered Karen to post a written apology on the neighborhood's Nextdoor page, acknowledging her wrongdoing and clarifying the actual property boundaries she had ignored. It was a rare addition but a fitting one, as the court recognized the extent to which she had attempted to distort public opinion with her false narratives. It was, in many ways, the one consequence she feared even more than the financial penalty. When the ruling was released, the neighborhood reacted instantly. Some residents refreshed the Nextdoor feed every few minutes, waiting to see whether Karen would truly follow through on the humiliating requirement. Others whispered about how such a public correction might shift the balance of influence she had maintained for years. Those who had once clung to her version of events began distancing themselves almost overnight, their previously loud opinions reduced to uncomfortable silence as the truth became impossible to deny. Meanwhile, Karen herself retreated into an almost ghost-like presence. She stopped her daily walks, stopped her HOA patrolling, stopped her usual habit of knocking on doors to offer unsolicited complaints about yard heights or trash can placement. Her blinds remained closed for days at a time. Only the occasional silhouette moving behind a window confirmed that she was still there, wrestling with consequences she never believed would reach her. For my part, the verdict brought a sense of relief so deep it felt like releasing a breath I had been holding for weeks. The weight of uncertainty evaporated, replaced by the steady assurance that the law had recognized the truth and refused to bend beneath intimidation or theatrics. Yet even as relief settled in, the aftermath carried its own strange energy. Neighbors who had kept their distance began stopping by during evening walks, offering quiet acknowledgments of what had happened. Some apologized for doubting me. Others admitted that they had long grown tired of Karen's bullying, but never knew how to stand up to her. A few even confided that they were inspired by the outcome, realizing that firmness, documentation, and patience could dismantle even the most entrenched neighborhood tyrant. The apology post finally appeared late on a Tuesday evening, and the moment it went live, the neighborhood vibrated with shock. Karen had tried, of course, to make it as sterile as possible, writing a tight, cold paragraph that barely met the minimum requirement, while clearly bristling with resentment. But the judge's specific wording requirement forced her to acknowledge that she had been wrong, that the driveway belonged solely to me, that she had arranged the towing without legal basis, and that her posts accusing me of harassment and obstruction were false. Seeing those words per words displayed openly on the very platform she had once used as her personal stage felt surreal. The comments rolled in almost instantly. Some were polite acknowledgments, others were relieved, a few were incredulous. But the most common reaction was quiet satisfaction from neighbors who had endured her behavior for far too long. The post remained pinned for the required length of time, unmistakable and unavoidable each time someone opened the app. For Karen, it was a social undoing unlike anything she had ever imagined. And while I did not celebrate her humiliation, there was no denying that seeing accountability made public brought a sense of closure that words alone could not fully describe. As the days passed, the ripple effect of the ruling became more pronounced. The HOA board, already struggling under the weight of public scrutiny, held an emergency meeting to review their towing policies and communication protocols. Though they never explicitly admitted wrongdoing, several members privately expressed regret for taking Karen's side so quickly, recognizing now how easily they had allowed themselves to be manipulated. Whether out of guilt or genuine concern for future disputes, they began adopting clearer guidelines and more transparent processes, steps that would ultimately benefit the entire neighborhood. Karen remained distant, hardly leaving her home except for brief, hurried errands. The once constant stream of complaints, notices, and passive-aggressive comments came to a complete halt. In their place was a silence that felt almost delicate, as though the entire block were adjusting to the absence of a force that had dominated it for far too long. I used the time to repair the small damages to my driveway, tidy up the areas the tow truck had scraped, and restore a sense of normalcy to my property. With each improvement, the sense of closure deepened. Yet as peaceful as things became, I couldn't shake the awareness that this was not the end, at least not for Karen. People like her rarely vanished quietly. They regrouped, redefined their narrative, and sought new ways to reclaim whatever power they believed they had lost. And although the legal chapter was closed, the social aftermath was still unfolding, shaped by every lingering glance, every cautious conversation, and every moment of collective neighborhood recalibration. Still, beneath all the uncertainty, one truth remained undeniable: the tide had turned. For the first time since Karen had moved in, the neighborhood no longer revolved around her. The balance of influence had shifted, and the false authority she had wielded for so long was crumbling beneath the weight of accountability. The next chapter, whatever it would bring, would unfold in a neighborhood fundamentally changed, one where people were finally willing to stand up, speak out, and push back when necessary. And for the first time, the road ahead felt open, steady, and entirely mine again. In the weeks that followed Karen's forced apology, the neighborhood settled into a strange kind of calm, as though the entire community were collectively relearning how to exist without the constant weight of her scrutiny. Lawns still grew, trash days still came and went, and children still rode their bikes along the sidewalks. But everything felt subtly different. The tension that had once simmered beneath every interaction seemed to dissolve, replaced by a cautious optimism that the days of petty power plays were finally behind us. Even the house lights at night seemed softer, as if the neighborhood itself were exhaling after years of being held hostage by one person's need for control. For my part, the stress that had dominated my life for weeks began to fade, replaced by a slow-building sense of normalcy. Yet normalcy felt almost foreign at first. I found myself checking the driveway more than necessary, half expecting to see an empty space where my truck should have been, or an HOA notice taped to my door. But as time went on, the fear ebbed, leaving in its place a quiet confidence. I had stood my ground, defended my property, and refused to let someone's entitlement rewrite the truth. And although the battle had been exhausting, the outcome reaffirmed something I hadn't fully realized I needed: the certainty that even in a small suburban community dominated by politics and personalities, fairness could still prevail. Karen, however, existed in a different aftermath entirely. The financial blow alone had been severe enough to shake her stability, but the social fallout cut far deeper. Her authority evaporated almost overnight, and the whisper network that once propped her up as the enforcer of neighborhood standards dissipated the moment accountability hit. Whether she realized it or not, the power she wielded had always been borrowed, lent to her by neighbors too weary or intimidated to refuse. Once that collective silence broke, she was left with nothing but the consequences she had earned. Her interactions became rare and uncomfortable. She avoided eye contact, kept her head low, and moved through the neighborhood with the defeated posture of someone who had lost more than a legal battle, someone who had lost her audience. Even those who once supported her kept their distance, unwilling to be associated with what had become the most public embarrassment the neighborhood had seen in years. It wasn't uncommon to overhear whispered conversations at mailboxes or on front porches about how things had finally changed and how just maybe the community could begin to rebuild itself into something healthier and more balanced. As for Karen's apology post, it lingered in the digital space longer than expected, preserved in screenshots, shared quietly in group chats, and referenced in private messages. It became a symbol of something bigger than a driveway dispute, a reminder that the loudest voice isn't always the correct one, and that those who weaponize community platforms for personal vendettas can be held accountable. People began adopting a newfound caution about HOA politics and neighborhood gossip, no longer willing to accept accusations without evidence or assertions without reason. The cultural shift was slow but noticeable. Neighbors who had never spoken more than a passing hello began engaging with each other, sharing small acts of kindness that felt almost revolutionary in a place previously dominated by fear of scrutiny. Yard tools were borrowed freely without suspicion, noise complaints were replaced with friendly check-ins, and community events, once empty, began to fill again with laughter and casual conversation. It felt as though the community was collectively healing, the wounds left by Karen's reign of micromanagement finally beginning to close. One evening, I stood in my driveway, the same driveway that had started all of this, and watched as the sun dipped behind the rooftops, casting long shadows across the quiet street. My truck sat exactly where it belonged, unmoved, unchallenged, a small but powerful symbol of regained autonomy. The moment felt peaceful in a way I hadn't expected. Not triumphant, not vindictive, just quietly complete. I realized then that the real victory wasn't the money, the apology, or even the court ruling. The real victory was the shift in the neighborhood itself, the awakening of a collective understanding that boundaries mattered and that standing up for them didn't make someone a villain. It made them a neighbor worth respecting. In the months that followed, Karen gradually receded into near invisibility. Some speculated she might move away, desperate for a reset in a new place where her reputation wasn't tarnished. Others believed she would stay, too stubborn to leave the house she had once bragged about owning outright. But whether she stayed or not became less and less important. The fear she once commanded no longer existed, replaced by the memory of a lesson she had unwillingly taught the entire community. Entitlement has limits, and truth has a persistence that no amount of manipulation can overcome. Eventually, life returned not to the old normal but to something better. The neighborhood learned how to breathe without someone policing its every move. The HOA, more cautious now, operated with clearer boundaries and more balanced judgment. And the residents, once divided by whispered loyalties and unspoken resentment, found themselves slowly reconnecting in ways that strengthened the community more than anyone expected. As for me, I moved forward with a steadier sense of confidence and a deeper appreciation for the place I called home. I said, the ordeal had been draining, frustrating, and at times deeply unfair, but it had also revealed the strength of documentations and unwavering perseverance. It showed that even in small suburban battles, truth had a way of rising, steady and undeniable, no matter how deeply someone tried to bury it under noise. In the end, Karen's attempt to claim my driveway had unraveled into a lesson far larger than either of us could have anticipated. It reshaped the neighborhood, challenged long-accepted dynamics, and revealed the fragile foundations on which her authority had rested. And as I finally closed the chapter on the ordeal, standing in the fading evening light with my home quiet and steady behind me, I realized something simple yet profound. Sometimes the biggest victories come not from winning a fight, but from restoring peace to the place where you live. And that peace, earned through persistence and truth, was worth every moment of the struggle it took to secure it.